morning, Simone and Stephen.
Morning.
How you guys doing this morning?
All good, yeah. Hopefully you guys are doing well.
Yeah, it's Friday, you know, always good to be Friday. Cool, let's see, so let's paste this here. Go ahead. Okay, let's see. I can go ahead and get started. How's everybody doing this morning? Hopefully got some interesting topics for you this week, some updates for the program overall, and then some application deployments and Kubernetes fun stuff that I've been looking at. I'm going to talk about a few things today. One of some new apps that we have running on our Cloud Native Apps Tanzu cluster, Dex and Keycloak, that are OIDC and OAUTH solutions. So we'll take a look at that. And also Harbor OIDC. And then we're going to talk about a little about the future. And I've been doing a lot of planning for I think, you know, you guys know that we've been talking a lot about some of the apps that we've had to do to help support, largely help support the HOL 2031 effort. But I think, you know, really the services that we have out there will serve a larger purpose to enable demo and authoring tools and more robust enablement and learning environments. So let's go ahead and we'll just go ahead and jump in and get started. So first thing, any open questions I should touch on this week? Okay. Well, as always,
I have an easy question for you. Do we have a lab for Harbor in the Ninja?
Yeah, absolutely.
We push do stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's actually I know there's a Harbor lab guide. Let's look at it real quick. And then there's several different lab guides that involve Harbor to different degrees. So let's look at the site real quick, and I'll look at a couple of them.
The reason I'm asking is because we are planning to add the Harbor lab to the essential PKS HOL. So
cool.
I want to give them one of your guides so they can just cut and paste it into the HOL.
And so Harbor pipeline install Harbor intro to Harbor. And this is just one of several that do, but you can see in the table of contents, the type of things that it does for Harbor here. And then we have, like I said, there's several other relatively advanced Harbor things that are tied into other labs that we can pull out as needed. And then
yeah, that should be enough. If you can Slack me that link.
Sure.
We should probably update the Harbor Lab for the new stuff that they just announced with, you know, being able to draw out, check the information on vulnerability scans and things like that.
Yeah,
might be worth doing an update.
A very good topic, because I wanted to do some cool. So Harbor's one of the most central services that we have in this. So like the two most important reasons why we need to have some of these services up are one, to get Harbor or get new images into the HOL, or if we wanted to have our own, you know, public Harbor server that we could use for whatever reason, right? But primarily to be able to get access to there. So the Harbor server, and then the GitHub clone. Those are the two that we really needed. But and Harbor being the biggest of those, most likely too, because the GitHub clone server does not require any sort of login, right? It's just a dumb clone to certain repositories and orgs on GitHub. But with Harbor, one of the things I've been thinking a lot is okay, so we have a Harbor server, and we also have a program where we want to allow people to be able to come in and write a blog or write a lab guide and tell people, hey, go over to that HOL and open up the lab and then do this or that activity. And that could require any number of program participants needing to be able to push images to the Harbor server. And so I don't have it fully implemented yet, but I'm making several changes to the Harbor server for to enable more advanced capabilities. But yeah, at the most basic level, it's that was one of the biggest reasons for the OIDC and OAUTH investigations I've been doing this week. Is kind of the intent with all of these servers and services that we're loading. So I think first, we needed a couple, and then once you need a couple things, then you need a couple more things, then you need a couple more things. And the nice thing is like I think at the end of it, it's really for me, it's given me a lot of firsthand experience. If I'm setting up this environment, there's a kind of a realistic scenario in here, and that we need to set up Kubernetes, and we need to set up capabilities in these new Kubernetes clusters, many of which are very general capabilities that most groups would need if they're setting up a Kubernetes cluster and enabling common features and services like OAuth, right? As a good example. And so with these services, part of it is having the service available so that just so even if you couldn't author directly to it very easily, right? It's still nice that we have the service available, but yeah, we want to get the authoring processes down. And so one of the initial things we need in the clusters is OAuth and OIDC, so we can log in, or it could be LDAP, or it could be SAML, but we need some way to make sure that if we host these assets out there on the public internet, they're not just being blatantly abused by any number of things that happen around the public internet, right? And so we'll look at, GitHub is an OAuth provider. Everybody who's participating in the program already has a GitHub account, essentially. I mean, it's really a requirement, and I didn't really want to require any other accounts to be able to access an asset. Like if we wanted to make a way for people to be able to log into Harbor so they can publish their own lab guide that uses images on our public Harbor server. And so you need to use OIDC and OAuth to be able to authenticate against GitHub. And I think, that's the intent for myself going forward with the Ninja program. And it's actually been the intent for quite some time, is to have the ability not only for people to take a lab guide, but for people to, one, we can kind of crowdsource assistance to help with various things, but more importantly, we have some realistic learning stuff. If we've got some assets there, like these services, one, they are production services for us, but we're doing them in a way that's intended for enablement, intended for education and participation, and a great opportunity for people who want to be able to become an admin for PKS Ninja stuff. Maybe it's helping to maintain, these services in the Kubernetes cluster and seeing how we do the authentication and logging in and doing various things. And so really wanted to, and then with GitHub, we're also doing GitHub projects. And so with, by leveraging the GitHub's OAuth capabilities, you can do things like, say, I have a Harbor server, or maybe it's a group that defines, it's say an arbitrary group I create in GitHub, or actually a team that I create in GitHub. I can assign GitHub users to that team. And then I could say, hey, if somebody logs in to Harbor with GitHub, validate that they're a member of team A or Z. And with that, you could use things like that to determine whether someone gets read-only permissions or read-write permissions within Harbor. So I have before we go further into like vision and things you want to do with that, I want to just start knocking some of these objects off the table because there's a whole lot of different complex things we're talking about. So I want to get back to what's the little basics of OIDC OAuth, and then we'll look at a couple of these servers that we have set up right now. They're live, that are doing some interesting things to help us towards those goals. So OIDC and OAuth are an extension of the same standard. And one of the primary differences is OAuth is not like a single, OAuth doesn't have a standard authentication endpoint. It's not like a standard authentication server that would go out and say like, I need to point to something that's going to, give me an IP address or a server that I can contact to say, will you approve me or will you not? It's kind of part of that ecosystem. OIDC is where you get like a server that you could say, this is my server. I have something like Harbor that has the capability to, has a screen on Harbor. Let's go look at Harbor and see, right? If I go to Harbor, and you can see I've got my OIDC provider login there, but I'm going to log in as admin right now because I don't have my OIDC account set up as admin. And so if I go into Harbor and I go into my configuration here, let's see, so authentication, you can see I've got OIDC configured, and I need to have an OIDC endpoint. Right? This is something that, so there's no way to set up OAuth / or OIDC or any of this stuff without an OIDC endpoint. You can't use Harbor to like directly query the OAuth APIs on GitHub. And so the OIDC endpoint it's very much, it's like that. It's an endpoint that and it's a server that can go out and reach out to different backends that may support OAuth. And OAuth is really, at least from GitHub's perspective, I think in every case, it's the same way. It's just like GitHub has API extensions for OAuth that conform to a very particular standard. And so a server that's running OIDC has that inherent capability to reach out to make very specific API calls against, say, the GitHub's OAuth API. So somebody who's an OAuth provider like GitHub, they'll have these very specific API calls, and the OIDC provider will be able to query those OAuth things. And like, what's the purpose? What's the point of doing things that way? Right? Like I can, think about like GitHub. The intent of their implementation, I mean, you could use it in numerous different ways, and I think they do intend that. But the reason why they don't have an OIDC provider endpoint and they do provide OAuth services is like an OIDC provider is oftentimes a lot like a single sign-on provider or have those similar types of capabilities where I could have one server. So if I were to go to like one of the ones that we have running now, you can go to keycloak.cloudnativeapps.ninja, and Keycloak is a big open source identity single sign-on type of server, and it supports things like LDAP, and it supports SAML, and it supports OIDC and OAuth. And so I could log into my OIDC provider, and I could have my OIDC provider work with several different providers on the back end that support OAuth. So like maybe I want to have a single sign-on for people to log in to GitHub and manage things through that central mechanism to get to a particular specially privileged organization within GitHub or something. I could use something like this Keycloak as an authentication proxy. So I could just authenticate against Keycloak, and then it can assign me, some granular permissions access within GitHub, but also other things as well. So I sign into Keycloak, and it could, if I want to then use that token that Keycloak gives me back to go and do things on GitHub, I could, but I could also potentially, query it for other services. And so OIDC is really meant to be like, your place where you have, a server that's running authentication as like centralized authentication services, where OAuth is more like if you have a service that you want people to authenticate against from a single sign-on type of utility. So I know it's all fairly convoluted. I didn't have, I do a lot of these off the cuff, what I've been working on up until 2 this morning, and try to give you the latest of what I've been working on each week. But with that, I do lack a little bit polish. I haven't prepared slide decks and so on. But so hopefully that's clear. But if there's something about what I've explained so far that's unclear, just stop me at any point. We'll go in and look at this in action and see how it works. So there's actually 2 different authentication services that we have running right now. And there's a lot of different authentication considerations. I forgot this one doesn't have a web front end. But we'll show how it works in a second. We do have Dex running here on Cloud Native Apps as well. So 2 of the big Kubernetes open source identification providers. One is Keycloak, and another one is, let's go to. Dex. And so both of these do similar things with but the Keycloak is a bigger initiative. Like Dex is really something that CoreOS created to be part of their Kubernetes solutions immediately. I don't know if Red Hat is using it. I don't really know much about the kind of like market and strategic background in that sense. So I don't know if this is still going to be part of the OpenShift vision, or if it's just part of CoreOS that's off on its own now. We'll talk a little about why I'm using this a little bit, especially with it being CoreOS. But they both do similar things, right? They use OpenID Connect, and they can assign ID tokens. And so once you set it up, it has an endpoint. And when you do want to get an endpoint from an OpenID Connect provider, like we just did from Harbor. So if you notice, Harbor here has an ability for us to specify an OIDC endpoint, which means that Harbor itself is acting as our OIDC client, and on our behalf. And so you always need to set up every OIDC server. You have to set up every client that is part of it, and you have to have a client application. So in this case, we want to log into Harbor and have Harbor authenticate against our OpenID OIDC provider. But what if we wanted to enable, just to get a token? We could do it with something like a with an Nginx ingress. So we could even have some random old web server maybe that we've had running around for a while that we still want to keep up, but we're not really interested in changing the code on, but we would like to put an authentication service in front of it. Doesn't need to be integrated. And you can go and say to your Nginx ingress controller, have it reach out and do an OIDC authentication on your behalf, right? But how would you do that? You need a client, right? And so my point is there's always a client. In some cases, if you're integrating from an app that already has a client in it, like Harbor, that's that. And if you don't already have a client application, there's several here. Where are they? Actually, there's several on the what is it? It's on, if you go to the Keycloak homepage, if you look around the Dex, there's several different people who make clients that you can use as they have a little CLI, and you can say, go log into this OIDC provider and then pull down the token for me, and then you can kind of do what you want with the token too once you have it as well. You don't need to there's ways to use it outside of an application like Harbor that's already pre-built to use it as well. And so you can see here, Dex has support for LDAP and SAML and OpenID Connect, and it's really a Kubernetes native single sign-on sort of solution. You may not, I don't know if you really think of this as like single sign-on in the scope of like huge cross enterprise IT, do everything, you know, Okta competitor type of single sign-on, but really in terms of if your worldview revolves around what you're trying to do in the Kubernetes cluster, which is kind of like how the cloud native apps.ninja, you know, everything is all about what we do inside that Kubernetes cluster, and then of course to GitHub. It's a good solution. The primary reason why I'm using Dex more than, so right now I'm using Dex more than Keycloak, and I may deprecate the Keycloak service depending on, you know, temporarily, is because Dex has better GitHub integration out of the box. And so one of the things I can do with Dex is right off of the bat, if I look at my, no, that's not it, like a sample configuration for Dex, let me show you what a Dex configuration looks like here. No, that's not it. Where did it go? Here we are. So if you look at how we set up the GitHub connection to Dex, here's an example. We can look at how ours is set up. But the important part is right here, orgs and teams. So Dex is the only single sign-on OIDC solution that I found, period, that has out-of-the-box abilities to authenticate both the orgs and teams. You can also specify a number of scopes and, you know, various different things, but if most, like the primary purpose of like GitHub's OAuth is really, it's like, say if you have some type of single sign-on, you want to let people go to GitHub and do things on GitHub. There's a huge range of scopes that I can include in here for what a user could do on GitHub, because they're authenticating against the GitHub OAuth, so they have all those primitives there. But I'm not using this to allow users to do something on GitHub. I'm used to using GitHub to authenticate and ideally authorize people to just as that AAA provider to do things on other applications. So it's a little bit different from how it's, you know, traditionally been used, although not unique. But it's just, yeah, really powerful to have that ability to say, and it's probably possible in Keycloak to do this, but it may involve some custom logic, because how the authentication connection works is this client will connect to GitHub, and the first thing it's going to do is it's going to use a standard GitHub claim or scope that reveals the once someone logs in, it's going to return the user's email address that's associated from that account. And then Dex has some custom logic there that takes the email address that's associated at that point and the token, and then makes another couple of API calls to pull down the org and team information if you specify it, and then validate to say, hey, is person on this team or not? And as a Dex is the only thing out there that I was able to find that had that functionality just out of the box. And so I moved forward with Dex for the Harbor integration. Overall, I like Keycloak better, and I like it's not CoreOS. It's a bigger initiative. It's got more feature robustness. It's a larger open source community, but it's not like it has. In my case, it doesn't have anything critical that I needed. I just, for me, I kind of have a preference to stay to something that's perhaps a little more neutral than I might perceive a CoreOS project to be, but at least it has this functionality out of the box. So now let's go into Harbor and watch this in action. So we can see here, I created my OIDC settings. It's really simple. You just log in as an admin. You go and you need to create this information. And after I show you the login here, I'll show you what these mean. And once you have this set up, you can click, you know, test OIDC server and save. And this user account here is actually, this is a user account I created through the this integration. So let's go ahead and log out and watch how I do that. So once you have it here, you can go ahead and assign various different permissions or what have you. Now, one of the things that's still new in Harbor that isn't quite a feature yet is being able to allow somebody to log in through through OIDC and then assign them to a group. But you can define scopes in your OIDC provider. So let me go back and show you that here. And so it's, this scope can provide granularity about what these users are allowed to do within within Harbor as well. But this is actually actively being updated in Harbor right now. These will be probably part of the 1.9.x patches to be able to define groups that you want, because you can do that with LDAP today. Somebody logs in with LDAP based on their Active Directory or group association. You can say they should have these particular capabilities in Harbor. That function is just very, very brand new around how to do that in Harbor and still under development. So I'm trying to get in the loop on that conversation so I can start testing that capability. Now, okay, so we've got our OpenIDC client. Now we'll go ahead and as soon as you do that, now I didn't specify a bunch of different tight scopes on here. It's pretty neutral, I think, right now. So you could probably do this as well. I'm going to take one of my GitHub accounts here, and I haven't logged in with this one yet. So let's just, oops, push the wrong login. I got a login on the top. But in the meantime, it's going to error first. So let me refresh. Fuel. Yeah, and once you save your OIDC configuration, this additional login prompt pops up here, and you still have the ability to log in with your local accounts as well using the separate login button. As you can see, I haven't logged in with my a fuel account before, right? And so now I'm logged in with this, and it logs me into this account I've set up for a reason right now to be able to work with assigning group permissions on a temporary basis, but it also loses the ability to track some of the capabilities the way I have it set up currently. So I'm looking at some of those new capabilities they're looking at putting into Harbor, probably within the next few weeks potentially. Okay, so we have that login, and so now let's look and see how exactly we have that set up. So let's go ahead and zero. Whenever I go back to Kubeapps after a while, I like to zero it back out to the home page. Sometimes if you just start on the page where you're refreshed on after a timeout or something, it seizes up a little bit. So let's just go back to all namespaces to get a little landscape. We saw we had Keycloak, and let's look at our Dex deployment here. And so we can see here the Dex deployment is actually just a single container solution, so it's very simple, very lightweight, and you can see some of the information that here in our Kubeapps portal on our Cloud Native Apps.Ninja Tanzu service. And these are the exact installation values. Fortunately for this one, it is actually pretty straightforward to determine the values that I wanted to put for my actual deployment, all through 100% through the Helm chart, which is a nice goal, because then every time you need to change anything, you can do it directly through the Helm chart. And so let's look at this Helm chart down here and see most of the stuff default values. Now, and then in Kubeapps, I like leaving, it'll automatically pull, is a general standard. I don't know if it's always true, but a general standard when you're dealing with Helm, nearly all the Helm apps out there have a standard file in the repository. And so you can always go to hub.kubeapps.com, or you could go to your own dedicated Kubeapps server. Either way, and you can find Helm charts that way. But when you're planning to deploy a Helm chart, it's often a good practice and desirable to go and find the GitHub repo. I think nearly every Helm chart, if not every Helm chart, is on a GitHub repo somewhere. At least all the ones that are available in Kubeapps. and you can go to the GitHub repo and you can find this file here that shows up by default in Kubeapps, which is values.yaml for the current version. And so Kubeapps automatically reflects that values.yaml file. I think you could probably specify if you had a different name, but I think this is standard, the default way of finding sample values and default values for Helm applications. And so normally if I was doing these outside of Kubeapps, I like to either comment out or just delete the defaults from this. This is if you do a deploy later, then, and if you save this and think, oh, I can, go to deploy later, and then the next thing you're going in and updating all the image tags manually if you do this outside of Kubeapps. Now, when you do it inside of Kubeapps, it's much easier, right? Because if I go to upgrade here, and it is a good question, right? And come on, Kubeapps. There we go. So if I go to upgrade here, and if I switch a different run, I don't know actually if it, it's an interesting question. Will it merge something like, what we have in our existing static configuration with what's in the new version of the values? I doubt it, right? And so, well, what happens is if when you're doing Helm chart deploys, I definitely recommend leaving the default values out of this, right? Like this, really, we should comment. And that way, if we get a newer values, let's say if 2.3.3 comes out in the future, right? And some of the default values, like for example, whenever 2.3.3 comes out, or 2.3.4 or 2.4, or whatever the next version of anything, and this isn't Dex, this is any app, right? Whenever the next version comes out, chances are it's going to need a new container. I ran into this with another one of the apps I was deploying recently, where it was having problems because I was accidentally pulling in old containers because I thought I was going to deploy my same values.yaml, and my values.yaml had old defaults specified where I really just wanted the default. Now, and it may be good practice to comment these as opposed to just deleting them. And that way, you've got a constant reference as to what the image version was for the version that you had originally deployed at this time. And, if you want to try to maintain that, but then, to maintain that over time, then you've got to come in here and manually update these things every time you do an upgrade. So I think, in general, the best way to deal with these things is there's kind of two ways. One is if you look at my Keycloak here, and I've got, where is it? Helm install. So one way is to do it like, do I have that open? Code Helm install staging. Okay, so rather than filling out a values.yaml file or an override file, one thing you can do is just to save a file somewhere, and I don't need all this stuff down here. That is save this for your reference somewhere, and here you can see if you're able to define everything that you need in your application, you've got all your override values here, and this, notice like this doesn't define any values that you haven't customized, and so it's an easy way you can document how you've installed your Helm application. I don't think this is the ideal way, by the way, but this is a functional way. And if you do save this information like this, then if you come and you can come and add an upgrade flag later, right? And you've maintained your unique parameters without keeping any old ones that you didn't intend to keep, right? And you can definitely specify, images and so on. But the thing is this doesn't change itself, right? It's not going to look at itself and realize, oh, the image isn't the newest. It's not going to upgrade until you tell it to, right? And so this is one way. And another preferred way would be to like, I'm not going to save this, but as you do this is like, just delete everything from here that you haven't customized specifically, right? So I know gRPC false, like that's a value that I changed, right? these are defaults. These are defaults, right? So I could delete that. The Ingress configuration, that is not default. That was, but search, image tag, this is all default, right? Now, one of the things that you need to do if you do delete values out of, Helm install chart is making sure that you don't mess up the logic, right? Because I might like say, oh, I don't need web, but I want to keep these secrets or something, right? And then if I were to go, if you look here, secret is a child of web, right? So if I were to take it and like just arbitrarily delete those because I didn't think I needed them without paying attention, now I have a dangling child here with no parent, and then the secret becomes a child to image pull policy according to YAML formatting, right? Which doesn't work, and this will error out, right? So you just be careful if you delete things. But in here, this, that, so these are all defaults. And so really what I want in here, and another common, you might hear these often sometimes referred to as like values.yaml. This method of doing it is often called an override file, because it's really just you're overriding the values that you want to change, but leaving everything else to default. So RBOC, that's all default, default. Pod disruption bot, that's default. The config for the issuer is custom, right? But not every aspect of the config for the issuer. So it's really just the name here that I've customized. And then so everything else there, anything else that is. And then so the static clients and the connectors, those are not default. So we'll pull that out. So I have my issuer. And notice I just, the connectors looks like it might be a child to something, right? And if I just did that delete like that, I've kind of made my connectors, it's still a separate child of the config. It's just important when you're doing deletes, right? It is a child of config. It's just important to look at that, right? Notice there's no other parents here. So connectors is a child of config. You can tell through the indentation, but it's just important you don't, again, change that logic. So okay. And so now I have this down to exactly what I want it to be. And I didn't actually change any values here. I just cleaned up my YAML file to remove the specifications. And that way, if they do come out with a new version, I can apply this file again. And I want to accept the defaults in the new version, right? And it does mean like, when I do the upgrade, I want to think about it. I want to go in and check and make sure that there's no breaking changes, right? By any new default. But in general, new defaults aren't going to change your configuration in most cases. And so you want to double check that, but I could take the same thing, and whenever the next version comes out, I could apply the same thing. This is just my config, right? Now, I already have an in-place implementation here. And if you notice, I'll go through it again, but on the last screen, I got to this page by selecting the option to upgrade my existing Kubeapps implementation. And so now now that I've edited this file, I can actually go ahead and just click submit to an upgrade, and it'll go through in its standard idempotent way, identify what's different in this configuration, apply it or not apply it, and update itself as well, update the Kubeapps records to update this particular file. So let's go ahead and submit that. And now that's ready. And that actually, again, it didn't change anything, but if you notice now, our recorded in Helm installation values file that it keeps associated in Kubeapps. Now, again, you may not want to keep this in Kubeapps, but even if you don't want to keep it in Kubeapps, one of the nice things about this is like you have to think about CI/CD strategies for Helm apps, right? And if your CI/CD strategy for Helm app involves you manually toggling a particular, like the deployment YAML for this, it really complicates the CI/CD strategy for how you're going to maintain a Helm app over time. Because then you think like, well, if I wanted to maintain something like this in a source control, like a GitHub or another Git, And I'm going to say whenever I change my configuration, I want to use a webhook to trigger a new build or an update. You know, how would I trigger that if I have this? Plus, I also need to go outside of this configuration and grab something from a trim from the deployment. If I go and modify the deployment without modifying this chart, and I go apply this chart again in the future, that's not going to retain the custom modification that I made to, say, a deployment manifest. Right? I have to, if I either need this Helm chart to become the center of how I do CI/CD, or I could, you know, potentially use a Helm chart to get something installed initially. And once I get it installed initially, go ahead and kind of pull the individual deployment YAML and service YAMLs and the various different individual object YAMLs back out into my source control and try to manage it going forward. But then you lose, there's so much value in Helm, right? Because the people who maintain these packages, like this is a really simple package with one container, but like you look at Harbor, you know, there's 12 different containers. I don't know how many, but there's a bunch of different containers in Harbor. Or if you go to Prow or like a lot of these really robust services, they have sometimes dozens of containers. And like another good example is like a lot of these include, like if they need a Postgres, they include the full Postgres there. And like as opposed to you giving them an account out of your Postgres, and like it's an interesting question. Should I have my own Postgres and assign an account to my Kubernetes app, or should I have it in my Helm chart? And have it deploy its own? Would it be less efficient if I had an app deploy its own Postgres implementation? And I actually don't think it is, because like one of the cool things, you get a well-maintained Helm chart, it has a Postgres implementation in it already that installs its own Postgres server. Well, that Helm chart, whoever's maintaining it is going to send you the upgrades for that, right? So you can just grab the upgrades and have it whenever the author of that Helm chart, if you trust that author, if something happened with the Postgres and they need to upgrade it or update it or maintain it, and somehow you can continue to use that Helm goodness. And when the Helm chart upgrades, it'll upgrade all of that for you. And so while you might want to maintain your own local database implementations for your own custom applications, if you have a third-party app that already has a Helm chart that already maintains those things, this is just a really, really powerful way, of keeping them maintained. And so whether you expose it in here and in source control, whether you expose it only in source control and you don't necessarily have to expose this values file here in Kubeapps, you can definitely do both. I think this methodology when you're using Helm apps of just keeping the override values is really powerful in being able to maintain the life cycle of your app. Okay, so let's see. So now we see our Dex configuration, and let's look at some of the details here. So, now that I cleaned that up, I'd like to review some of the defaults. So let's go back here to our values.yaml file. So if you want to find a values.yaml, you could just like stable, there we are, stable Dex chart. And so you can see chart stable. If you search for it in Kubeapps Hub, you see that it's under the stable family. And like any, pretty much any one of these Helm charts, you've got your values.yaml here. And that's the same file we were just editing. But I want to look at it a little bit more. Right? We can see it pulls an image from somewhere. And we have some configurable options. You can really define a lot of additional things in here, resource limits, and I have gRPC capabilities turned off right now, but this does have the ability to do authentication proxy for gRPC as well. And so we could enable that functionality. And the standard default for internal communication for port numbers works fine. If you just deploy the default, it'll expose externally on port 443. And these port numbers are really used internally. They're like standard default numbers. So it's pretty nice if you do use Dex or use any blogs or documentation articles on how to integrate with Dex. These are just the standard port numbers. It creates a cluster IP service, right? So we can see that to be able to serve the Dex web services within the cluster. And then by default, the ingress is false, right? And we will look at our ingress configuration in a second. So we can customize that. And then let's see, what is this search stuff? So I believe the search keyword, you can you can find all the information about this right here on the homepage or in Kubeapps. But if we go back, you'll see all of the stuff. This is basically the same information that is, if you find the chart within Kubeapps, it also reflects the same page. And you can see, go in here and I forget, what was that value? I just said I wasn't sure what it was. It was like search something or another. And yeah, and so what these are is if you aren't using an external ingress for HTTPS termination, you can define certs for it'll do its own HTTPS termination, and the same thing for gRPC. In this case, we're not using gRPC, and we are using an external ingress controller. So if you look at, so one of the things, if you look at, so let's go back. Where's our Kubeapps? Our deployment here, notice I have gRPC is false, and that inherently disables all the other gRPC related values that are in, that are in this. So we're not doing gRPC, so all this cert stuff is not relevant, and we're also not doing our, we're doing our web HTTPS termination in the Nginx ingress controller, and so we don't have that enabled locally on Dex. And so all this stuff, we don't need to worry about any of that. By default, there's an RBAC configuration here, and it automatically creates a service account for itself. I just left that, works fine. You can define pod affinities if you want, right? A lot of different things you could potentially do in here, but you don't need to. Now the issuer is important, right? This issuer needs to, once OIDC provider issues, it's going to issue from something, and that needs to match everything else. And so if your provider is, like in our case, dex.cloudnative.apps.ninja, your issuer needs to match that. Or what happens is like when it responds back, the headers you'll actually get a response back, but your client will say, I got a response back from, it says it came from a host that thought it was called dex.io 8080, and that's not what I see in my client configuration. So you need to make that map. That's pretty much, and then here we go, the important part. So there are connectors. So there's several connectors for several different OAuth providers. Out of the box, and you don't necessarily need a custom connector for OAuth, but it's nice that they have kind of like pre-optimized integrations for different OAuth providers. And then the last thing is you have to define like who are the clients of this OIDC server that we're going to accept queries from, right? So in this case, we'll see Harbor. So let's jump back over to our specific configuration and review our specific values. So everything we deleted, we just kind of reviewed, and here's the things that we've changed. So I'm disabling gRPC proxy and our authentication proxy, right? And we are going to enable the ingress service. We're going to enable our custom annotation. So we'll have a Nginx class. So an annotation that defines this as being in an Nginx class. And our cert manager, which we've talked about before, and what that does is it goes out to let's encrypt, and it takes our defined host names values, which are both of these, and it certifies those with the let's encrypt public CA service, so we can go to Dex, or we can go to Dex Ninja-Labs prod US West. And so the idea here is, actually, it should reverse the order of these. This host should think of itself as by its location, but it should also respond to the location independent. Because if we don't have this configured for HA yet, but the intent here is to have this set up for HA at some point. And when you do have a host that's in an HA configuration, you need to have the ability to both have its certificates issued and able to respond to the global service as well as the site-specific service. And so these both point to the same exact thing, but you do it is important to know that you have to have one of these listed as your primary and one listed as your alias in your cert request. Let's Encrypt service takes care of that for us, but you need to have them both there as one way or another if you're not doing it with Let's Encrypt. And then our TLS configuration, this is our standard TLS configuration, our standard ingress configuration across all of our production services that we've right now. And this will tie into our cert manager. Our cert manager will create the secrets here for us that we need to enable TLS on the host, and then it'll just work elegantly. And then we get into our issuer. This is our OIDC specific, and this is saying for this server. And then one of the other things I really love about Helm, like if you actually go and dig into the Dex documentation, normally this is actually the Dex server configuration, kind of like an Nginx configuration file or something, right? This has nothing to do with Kubernetes, nothing at all, right? You need to apply the same sort of configuration file. And it's interesting, if you do manually want to go and build a Dex server outside of Helm, you use a Dex command line to apply this config, right? You don't even do a kubectl apply. And I love that with the Helm integration here, I can not just create the Dex server configuration file through Helm and through this one common file, but I can also update it, right? If I want to make a Dex specific configuration update that is really just the server configuration of Dex, has nothing to do with the Kubernetes objects, I can go in and update this, hit through the upgrade function here, toggle this file, hit apply again, and it'll just upgrade my Dex server configuration through the Helm chart without needing to maintain a separate file. So it's really elegant functionality. And we can see, so GitHub, now to create a client in GitHub, let's go ahead and jump into GitHub and we'll see how we do it. There's two different ways to find your developer settings in GitHub. There's one, you have developer settings associated with an org. And so if I go back here a couple times, you see here that I am in VMware Cloud Native Apps org. I can go into org settings and I can say OAuth apps. And I can see here I have dex.cloudnativeapps.ninja, and I also have my my other one, what did I call it? Keycloak. And so it's really easy to create these. Let's go ahead and let's see the create prompt first before we look at a complete one. So if I say new OAuth app, I just give it a name, whatever name I want, right? I give the URL of my server. So this would be like, you can see dex.cloudnativeapps.ninja. And then every server that supports OAuth authentication has to have a callback URL. And so in this case, Dex or Keycloak, if they were to provide an OIDC service that communicates with this OAuth application on our behalf, then it will they will provide the callback URL for you. So I can see with Dex, Dex has a callback URL, right? And in that case, by default, it's the /callback Keycloak. And Harbor actually has a callback URL, but you don't use the Harbor callback URL here. You use that on Dex when you create the client, because Harbor doesn't authenticate directly with GitHub, right? Harbor's authenticating with your OIDC provider, which is proxying to GitHub on your behalf. So when you create the OAuth application in GitHub, you'll do it for your OIDC provider. And then when you have an app like Harbor running in your cluster, you have to do your basic, that configuration that we saw a minute ago. This client is basically the same exact thing we're doing in GitHub, except that we're doing this to our Dex server for our Harbor client. And so our Dex server is a client of GitHub, and our Harbor server is a client of the Dex server, if that makes sense, right? And so we're really just, for Dex, we have to go to our GitHub to create the app. And then for Harbor, for children of our Dex, then we have to go ahead and do this, basically the same exact setup here, but on the Dex server. And so now that we see how to do that, let me see how to do it for Dex, right? They generate the client ID for you once you provide the information. So I said I wanted dex.cloudnativeapp.ninja. This is my homepage, and because the Dex server inherently provides a callback value, that's what it is. I put in those information, hit save, and it provided me the user ID and the certificate. And then you can go into this config, you put in the client ID, the certificate, and if you go back to my Dex standard values.yaml file, you'll see there's a part I don't have in my current configuration that I'll add back in. And that is, if you look at their GitHub reference, connector reference, you'll see it also specifies orgs. And there's actually, they have a different one that also specifies teams. I think I showed it to you a minute ago. So you can go and add those values in later. I'm not specifying orgs and teams at this point in time. Right? This is the initial prototype, but I'll go ahead and enhance that later to customize the team and show you the results of that. I can't believe we're already pretty much out of time. I think it's, let me just make sure we finish that. So that's the config. And then the last thing you need to do after you configure your connector connection to GitHub is you have to say that I'm going to have a client. My client's name is Harbor. And this is where you see like Harbor provides a callback. And so on the Harbor server, this is actually provided. I'm not logged in, but if you do go back to that OIDC setup page, it shows you that value right on your OIDC configuration on Harbor. So you put your redirect in here, you give it the name of a secret, you give it a secret. And this is obviously not the most ideal way. I need to configure, some sort of HashiCorp vault or the other one that Pivotal uses a lot. I need to set that up still. But in the meantime, so that's it. That's our Dex deployment. Kubeapps itself can authenticate against OIDC. So right now, if you were to go to this, you'll be able to get to this server. But you'll see that if you go to our Kubeapps by default, it's going to ask you for a token. So you have to like log in to kubekettle and like find a service account and then pull the token from the service account and come back to Kubeapps and type in the service account. So I'll plan to set up OIDC now that we have it running in whatever applications that we have running in Cloud Native Apps.Ninja. And so I did not get through nearly everything I was intending to on this call. I was trying to keep it ambitious, which I think is I'm fine with it. I think this was fairly complex. I don't have it groomed into like lots of polished PowerPoints, which I hope is okay. It's like I said, it helps us to cover a lot more topics. And I do hope after I get these deployed and polished out there, we'll come back with some of those assets and some nice PowerPoints. But being you all in this call are the closest to the community, I wanted to kind of give you the latest, greatest information in its most raw sense. So let me stop there. I know I only left 2 minutes for question and answer, but I'll hang out for as long as needed. So any questions or feedback as well, if the format works for you, if you have any recommendations for updating the format.
Oh, this was pretty nice, Art. Yeah, thank you. Might have to put these recordings on the drum beat. This is especially this one. A lot of good information for people that are trying to set up those things.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, good stuff, Art. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. How's it? You going good, Nate?
Yeah, I'm doing.
Busy, right?
Too early in the day to tell still, but yeah, I think I'm all right. Happy almost weekend.
Good stuff. Well, hopefully you enjoy your weekends, everyone. Thank you so much. And again, if anyone has any questions, I can hang out longer or just ping me on Slack anytime.
Thank you, Art.
Thanks.
Thanks, Art.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.